My name is Lanny Cohen. I'm the Global Chief Technology Officer at Capgemini. And first of all, I want to welcome everyone to our Applied Innovation Exchange. Usually I get about 30 minutes to talk to groups about what the Applied Innovation Exchange is and what Capgemini's strategy is around applied innovation, but I'm not going to do that tonight because you're really not here to hear me talk about that. This is a unique facility. As you can see, I'm wearing a little bit of a badge here, and some of my colleagues from Capgemini also. So after we're done with this part of the program, if you want to talk to any of us to get more information about what we're doing here and why we think it's a pretty special environment, please do. We'll be happy to tour you around the facility as well. But the basic premise is that we feel innovation is not a random act. It's something that can be predicted. It's something that can be measured. It's something that can be planned. And we've developed a model that we refer to as applied innovation, because we also believe is that it's the application of innovation that's the big story in the market today, and where a lot of our clients really are challenged. Not so much finding the innovation and finding the next shiny object, but how do you really apply it? How do you adopt it? How do you scale it in a global enterprise, and how do you sustain it? And that's what this space and this whole model's about. It used to be a data center here and a yoga studio in the front until we got our hands on the place. So as I tell people, if this doesn't work out for us, we can pretty much open a soul cycling center here. If worse comes to worse, we can do it pretty quickly. So again, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Peter and John, and we'll get right into the program. Pete?
Thank you, Lanny. No, really, thanks for opening the space up. When Lanny, they just opened this recently, and they were relatively new to town, and they essentially approached us, my company Reinvent, myself, and said, we're happy to open this up to the Commons. Let's open this space up, have innovators in, do what you want to do. Let's pull together a program and let's kind of create a series here. And it's something that I've been thinking about for a long time, is how do we, there's so many interesting networks of folks in the Bay Area here. There's so many areas of exploding in innovation. And so at the same time, they're isolated. They're in their own little spaces, and there's not enough places to cross-fertilize networks. And so I said, if we can take advantage of this space and on a monthly basis find a way to gather folks like yourself, and over the course of the year, every month we're going to be doing this, and we're actually going to have a conversation starter like John, but really it's also a dialogue with who we're bringing together, because from my point of view, everybody here is doing something interesting. The people we've invited are all doing something interesting, all have a piece of the puzzle of what is the story going on in San Francisco, in the San Francisco Bay Area right now. And so that's the kind of idea of this thing. And so to kick it off, I basically checked in with John, and he said he'd be happy to kick this thing off. So I'm going to introduce John the way I was introduced to John. And
what, 24 years ago?
John, for those of you who don't know John was the founding managing editor of Wired magazine, which was founded in '93, a long time
Well, we
ago.
founded it in '92. The first issue came out in '93.
Okay, there you go.
Yep.
Founded in '92. And it got so successful so early that there came a point where they needed to hire some actual journalists beyond the crew that started it out.
I was the only actual journalist at Wired. That's actually true.
That's exactly true.
We had 5 people in editorial, but I was the only one who had practiced journalism.
And so I was one of the journalists out there who was a little early to this story, was early on this internet story, what was this thing? And so they figured that out, and they said, hey, come on to San Francisco and let's talk about maybe working for Wired. So I'm packing to go for this interview to Wired, and I'm with my wife, who is basically here today, Sharon, and I'm packing. I said, I'm going to wear tennis shoes to this interview. She was just aghast. Tennis shoes? You can't wear tennis shoes to an interview for a job interview. And I said, well, I don't know. Wired's a little different place. It's going to be worth doing. So I said, okay, I went with the tennis shoes despite a little worry about that. And so I get to San Francisco, get to the building, get to the room. I'm waiting for John. Door swings open. There's John. And I look down, and he's in bare feet. I had overdressed for my interview with Wired.
We didn't have air conditioning.
Down to earth with John.
Yeah.
But here's the thing about John. So what's interesting about this interview was they didn't really care about the skill set necessarily as much as whether I understood the story. And this is what I kind of want to start talking about today, which is what they really want to know is, did I get the story that was happening in San Francisco at that time, in this space of the digital revolution kind of space? What was really, did you get it? Did you grok it? And I did, and in fact got hired. But I think this idea of story is a really important one.
Yeah.
And I think it's actually part of what we're trying to do here with this series is over the course of the year here is to rough out in real time, what is the story happening in this amazing city right now?
Yeah.
There is so much going on. It's exploding in innovation, but it's also happening so fast and so kind of crazily, it's not clear how you really rough it out, how do you explain it, how do you pull it together, how do you make sense of it. And so I thought with John to start off is just looking back, since this is the first one, let's get a little foundation for what's happening in San Francisco now is, when you look back on that time, what do you see as the key story that really laid the foundation for the next couple iterations to get us to now?
It's interesting. I mean, we are 3 blocks, 2.5 blocks from where Wired started. And this neighborhood, man, in 1992 was a dump. And that's why we were there, because we had no money, and so we could afford, the warehouse on 2nd and South Park, which is now, I don't know, $85 a square foot, but back then it was like 85 cents. The narrative was, the core driving narrative was, no one knows what's going on, but we've got it. We figured it out,
Right.
Like we were we were evangelical. We were certain that we had seen a future and everything was going to change. But most people we talked to about it, including very smart people who were well established in lots of industries, thought we were crazy. And it's weird now to think that was true, but we were like, digital technology is going to change everything, and we don't know exactly how, but we just know it's going to happen, right? And that was our story, is how do we imagine what could be, find a narrative actor in the present who may get there, or may not, but has the chance to get there, and then tell the story of how they do, right? So the editorial framework was essentially to imagine the future, as Kevin Kelly, who was a co-founding editor, said, and go out to the future and bring back fresh kill. That's how he used to put it, and I think it was perfect, because the approach was, we believe this can happen, so let's tell the story of how it can happen, because then maybe we can get a conspiracy of good going, and it will, right? And on the way, there's lots of bad turns we could take, terrible legislation, or all sorts of things that could stop the story from happening. So let's have a point of view about, no, we can't do that. Right, and so that was the animating kind of ethos, was imagining what was possible in a story that was not being paid attention to very well. Most of the coverage of technology in the early 90s and late 80s I was part of. I came out of the trade magazines, and the trades were covering feeds and speeds and new models and hard drives and size of chips and blah, 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 right? And it was all sort of very verticalized. And we were like, no, this is a horizontal story across all of society. And so we'd send reporters out to go think about what happens, and remember, 1992, when there's a computer and a network in every school, what changes, right? What's possible when that's true? And that was Bill Gates' whole thing, right? A computer on every desk and in every home. That was like a way out there vision. There's no way that's going to happen anytime soon. But it happened very quickly, right? And so we'd imagine these things, and then we'd send writers out, and we kind of ran out of writers, because there weren't that many writers who would, basically you ask a journalist to bite on a belief, to have a conviction. That's like not in normal journalist nature to say, yeah, I'm a card-carrying believer, right? It's like, no, I'm a complete skeptic is the general approach. So it was hard to find those kinds of writers. And so we ended up using a lot of science fiction writers.
Right.
Because they buy, it's true. So when I was like 26 years old, I'm editing William Gibson and Bruce Sterling and Rudy Rucker and Neil Stephenson, all these insanely talented people. And instead of writing science fiction, we're like, hey, why don't you go to Singapore and just tell us what it's like? And Bill Gibson comes back with Disneyland with a death penalty, right? It's like, it was shooting fish in a barrel. It was like so cool, the stories that came back from these people.
And do you feel largely it's pretty much filled out? I mean, that's basically.
I think the story happened, and to me, that's sort of where we are now.
A new kind of.
The subhead to a piece that I wrote about a month ago was, "We won, now what?" You know, and I think that's really important. I think that's where we are. Is we need a new narrative. Because the technology narrative, which is super important and always will be, is now central. It's not orthogonal. It's the narrative, right? So we need to continue to understand and pursue that narrative. It's important. But what now? Now that it's central, where does it go? And it strikes me it goes laterally, and we start to talk about the change that is not about to happen, but that is in fact happening now. And we need to understand it, and we need to think about what we can do that we couldn't do before. And it includes systemic changes that maybe many people are afraid of or have reasons to resist.
Well, so you're kind of fast forwarding to the future here, and you.
Well, no, we're here.
Exactly. And John has started a new company. We could call it NewCo Platforms, I guess would be the broadest way to think of it. And there's a media piece of it, which is NewCo Shift.
Yep.
And when I was talking with John earlier about this, we were reminiscing about Wired, kind of like we just were doing, and he said, you know, there's a lot of similarities to the feel for what you're feeling of what this amorphous story is out there. There's something happening that's bigger. It's hard to explain. People can't really get it, but they know it's there.
And then when you bring it up to people, they look at you like you're crazy. That happens a fair amount, which means I think we're onto something.
Exactly. So talk a little bit about that. What's the story that you're groping at here that you think is
I think that the fundamental true north of how we've organized our economy is about to shift completely, and that's why I use the word shift. That wasn't intentional, but people listening to me talk about the editorial purpose behind what we're starting, they kept saying, "You're saying shift a lot." I'm like, okay, let's just call it that. But it's about to shift, and it has to shift not just because it sort of, I think, makes sense for it to shift. It has to shift because if it doesn't shift, we're out of a planet. We're done. Now, this is a very optimistic media property, just like Wired was, but I believe that that is a pretty compelling and powerful force for why we need to change. So the engine that we built to drive, you know, Western and increasingly other forms of capitalism was what I call a corn syrup fueled, fossil fuel driven, like muscular American V12 engine. And we built it sort of post-war to around now. And we built it to outcompete an enemy. And that enemy was a different approach to the world that was broadly called communism. And we won. We built the most muscular, most throughput, like highest growth, most consumption, most production. You know, we built this thing, and the boomers who are now retiring were really the ones who built it. And, you know, encouraged by administrations and basically an entire school of thought, a philosophy, which is the true north of this old way of looking at the world, which was sort of the Friedman Chicago school of, you know, maximize shareholder value, right? And you go public and you just make those shareholders money. You extract capital from your business and put it into the pockets of your shareholders. We took our entire retirement system and turned it into that. So instead of having an understood social contract with your employer and with the government for pensions, we said, no, we're going to maximize shareholder value, and that means everyone who needs a retirement gets a 401k. And we sort of sold it as you're now in charge of your retirement, and people bought that. I mean, I have one, you probably have one, we all have one, right? But how's it doing right now? You know? Right? My mother, who's 82, is terrified, you know, because she's one of these people who's going to live longer, and she doesn't know how she's going to live on what, you know, what the retirement that she built over the last 40 years. So we have to shift from that approach to capitalism, which had a byproduct. We won the Cold War, awesome. We had an existential moment in the early 60s. The Cuban Missile Crisis was kind of the apex of it, where we said, oh my God, an entire generation coming into the economic scene, the boomers in their youth, were forged in this moment of, at any moment as I'm walking down the street, the world could end. It could end. That was the zeitgeist in the early 60s. If you've seen that Mad Men episode about it, it's like, whoa, you know, have a few drinks and watch that again. So now here we are at another moment of existential crisis, but it's a boiling frog problem. It's not like the world could be wiped out tomorrow and we need 7 men in a room negotiating about how to make that not happen. We have 7 billion people pushing buttons all the time that's creating an increasing sense of unease in the world. And a powerful force that we need to change the economic engines that are creating an output which at the end of the day is not sustainable. And that output is not just rising temperatures, it's rising inequality. When you have maximizing shareholder value, what happens is shareholders, particularly ones with lots of shares, get richer and richer, and those that have few shares or no shares get poorer and poorer, and the middle class starts to disappear, which is not a sustainable society. And I'm not just a raving lefty or lunatic. I'm hearing this from chairmen of the boards of large public companies. I'm hearing this from CMOs who are responsible for figuring out how to repurpose the identity of a company so that consumers who are millennials who are saying that their #1 issue is that we will not buy from or work for a company that is not adding positive value to the society, right? And so if you have someone like Paul Pullman from Unilever, when he became CEO in 2009, declaring, I am not doing guidance anymore, and if you're not buying my shares for the long term, as I am currently going to manage this company from now forward, then I don't want you as my shareholder. That's like a very brave thing for a Fortune 50 CEO to say, but it's a marker of a shift that's happening. So while it's a little radical to say that we need to basically change the philosophy of our economic engine, and we need to start thinking about sustainability as a social issue, not just as a climate issue, I think it's coming, and I think it's going to affect really great and interesting, stories. And so NewCo Shift wants to tell those stories.
Wow. How much of this, you mentioned the boomers, you're talking generationally, is driven by generational kind of changes? I mean,
well,
millennial generation in particular.
I grew up sort of in the middle, right? And the generation gap was just a thing, right? I think there's a bridge between the boomers and the millennials. First of all, in the world that we live in here, throw a stone, there's someone been funded by a boomer, right? And it's probably a millennial. It's been funded by a boomer, either indirectly or directly. The boomers have all the money. They do. They're the richest generation in the history of ever. And even though they took a hit in 08, 09, they still are. They have most of the capital. Most of it's in large institutional organizations like T. Rowe Price and Fidelity, who have been investing in this space. Why? Because there's no IPO market, so they're all doing privates, right? And of course, they're LPs, and but the boomers, I think, are in a period of legacy assessment. I've worked for 40 or 50 years. I'm facing mortality. What is my legacy? Did I make the world a better place? Did I leave it in an increasing returns kind of society? And I think if they're being honest with themselves, the answer is no. Now, the millennials are also in a legacy assessment phase. I'm just starting my career. What am I going to do with my life? What will my legacy be? So they're asking the same questions, and I think there's this opportunity to bring them together. And when I talk to advertisers and to people who I work with on my team, and they say, well, what's our demographic? And I say, well, it goes from 22 to 82. They're like, no, that's not going to work. And I'm like, no, I really think that there's a shared issue across everyone who has a stake in the economy. I think there's a story there that sort of goes across demographics.
Well, when you say NewCo, what you mean something by that? What do you mean by that? We used to have a thing at Wired where we knew what was Wired and we knew it was Tired. We used to have a way, and it was.
My Wired Tired is NewCo Oldco.
Exactly. So what is a NewCo?
There's no new ideas.
How do you explain?
By the way, we ripped off Wired Tired too. It's like there's no new ideas.
So how do you try to define a NewCo then? What is it, if you don't just get it?
Yeah. So NewCo is short for new kind of company. And it's inclusive. It's not just startups. It's there are NewCo efforts like Capgemini is not a small company. It's a very large company, but this is their expression of the NewCo vibe, right? They're trying to engage with innovation and network and understand and incorporate that back into their corporate culture. So we have kind of a 5 or 6 point test of what makes a NewCo, and it's not like you got to check every box, but the number one most important is if you are on a mission. Not if you have one, because there are board committees of large companies, working with Landor and other agencies to figure out what their new mission statement is that would work best and focus grouping it to death. You can have a mission. Most companies have one. But if you're on one, it's different, right? And being on a mission is how you hire the best people. Being on a mission is how you align and make decisions. I was talking to the president of Microsoft recently, and they just got a new mission. They rewrote it. When Satya came, they built a new mission. GM just built a new mission. They had to. The ignition switch was kind of a wake-up call, right? And they wanted to shake up the corporate culture, so they want to have a new mission. They want to be on that mission, right? And it's interesting, all the large companies that are rebuilding their missions right now, if you read the old ones, I'm writing a piece on this weekend. If you read the old ones, so you're getting a preview, and you read the new ones, the old ones almost all have at the center something about how their mission is to provide financial results to shareholders, right? But the new ones are all about taking care of their customers and their employees. That's a shift. That's an important shift, right? So we look for, is the company on a mission? And of course, what I noticed when we started NewCo back, it was just a passion project for 2.5, 3 years. When we started back then, it was just an idea of how do we kind of change up the conference thing that I'd been doing for over 2 decades. And I just couldn't get out of bed for it anymore. I just didn't want to do it anymore, even though I'm still doing it in certain ways, but I wanted to do something differently. And I said, what's really interesting is when I see a company that seems super cool, I go into the company. And that's just because I was a journalist for so long, and that's like my instinct is just to call someone up and say, can I get in there? And then you see what, like, here we are in this space, and you understand this space now, right? You see what's on the wall, it's got manifestos, it's got dual manifestos, it's got, sort of this going on. You can the data you get when you go into a company is deep, and it means a lot. You see the person running this on stage at an event for 15 minutes, you don't get this, right? So,
but could you just, I don't know if everyone understands what you do.
So
explain the festival, how that works.
So,
awesome.
so I have a friend, Brian Monahan, who's now back with us at NewCo, which I'm stoked about. He took me on a bike ride, which is, of course, it's biking is the new golf, right? And so we're riding, and he's like, dude, because I stopped Web 2 Summit. I just didn't want to do it anymore. And I thought the brand had kind of apex. I mean, it was making a lot of money, but it just wasn't getting me going. So he said, dude, we had like whole people came in. There was like, we did all these things. We had these other meetings. Like you kind of screwed us up on that, And I'm like, I had no idea, I'm sorry. And he's like, you got to do another event. And I'm like, what? No, I don't. He's like, I got an idea for you. He said, the cool companies in the city that are kind of popping up everywhere, and the best ones. And he ran innovation for IPG, for McCann, and his job was to connect cool startups to big brands, right? And so he saw a lot of them. He said, you know what's interesting about the best of them? I said, what? He said, they all are on this mission to make some really significant positive change. And I said, yeah, actually that seems true. And it kind of stuck with me. And then we came up with this idea of turning a conference inside out, which later, once Airbnb was started, we called Airbnb-ing the conference. So Airbnb is not about going into one central hotel in the middle of the city and missing most of the culture around the city. It's about going out into the homes of people, whether they're there or not, but going out into the homes and living kind of like a native. So what we did is we turned it inside out, and we pick NewCos, companies that are interesting, cool, on interesting missions, and they open their doors, and you go around the city and visit the companies. And there are intimate sessions in each company where you meet the founders, you see what's on the walls, you get to ask them questions. And during a day, you can go into 5 or 6 of these companies in a day. It's exhausting work. You're tired at the end of the day. We have meetups at the end of the day, and people are like dragging ass, Whereas like at a typical conference, you've been sitting on your ass ignoring the speaker for like the whole day, and all you want to do is go drink, right? But like at the end of the day, our meetups are like, man, that was amazing. I just got to drink and sit here for a second, you know. But they're really cool, and now they're in 17 cities around the world.
They're awesome.
And they're fun to do, and for me, I feel like, you know, I got a key. I got to go to cities and just run around and check out, like, oh, look, Mexico City, Istanbul, you know, woohoo, Barcelona. It's awesome. I think it's like a passport.
Well, so you explained it there, but I derailed you a little bit from filling out a NewCo.
Oh, right.
So you
We
got
were
a
talking
mission.
about something else.
No, it's good because I think it's to understand how it started, but also to understand these NewCos. Just give us a few more attributes of what makes a difference, or what makes one of these things. Is it synonymous with a startup? Not really.
It's not
or
really.
Is it kind of?
Startups are, I think, what got the NewCo idea going, right? A new kind of company usually is a new company. But also, there are other attributes that we pay attention to. And it's hard to get these scored. I'm working on that right now. It's difficult. It's mostly editorial judgment, which, you know, I'm a big fan of, because it basically gets to say, I'm right, and I don't, you know, sorry, someone's got to be an arbiter. But you kind of know a NewCo when you see a NewCo, right? But another key attribute is the way that they treat their employees and the way they treat their community. So an old co approach to employees is human resources, an asset that is that wears out and is expendable. That's the sort of the Taylorism approach to employees, you know, the industrial approach to employees, which has really been codified in sort of cubicle farms and you know, managed by numbers and that kind of stuff. And that, of course, McNamara and the Whiz Kids and all of that became corporate America, right? And if you worked at a place like that, you worked at that job so you could have a life, right? And you had your life outside of the job, you know, because I talked to a guy yesterday who came by, 80 years old, he was a notary, and he came by and he looked around and he said, what is everybody doing here? I said, we're writing stuff and we're doing this. And he said, well, when it hits 5 o'clock, do you leave? And I said, I don't even know when it's 5 o'clock. Like, how do you know when it's 5 o'clock? What's happening now, and particularly in startups, and certainly at Wired, and one of the reasons that, like, you know, I even saw my wife in the first year of Wired, was because she just started coming to the office because that's where I was living, right? We live our work and we work our life. And that is very normal for younger people, and it's normal for people in the startup world. And we talk about balance and we talk about this, but the idea is that you try to create a workplace that honors life in the work and honors work in the life, right? We have all these devices and it kind of drives us into, we had an existential crisis for about 10 years around cell phones, you remember all of that? And now we're starting to learn how to integrate. It's not work-life balance, it's work-life integration, right? And so, like, if I need to not be at work for 3 hours because I got to go home and take a nap, that's okay, you know? Or if you want to take one under your desk, that's fine too, right? But it's, you got to get your work done, and we trust you to get your work done. And you manage your employees as a key asset of the business, not as a human resource of the business. So we look for that. And there are ways to score that. There's, you know, it's imperfect, Glassdoor, blah, 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 right? But at the end of the day, you know, you kind of know it when you see it. So that's one. Another is openness and transparency. And the way we mark that is if a company has had a public, because it's hard to report the private stuff, but it has had a public moment where it has had an opportunity to tilt towards the open or tilt toward being transparent, a NewCo thing is to do that. For example, back to the Microsoft discussion, they've now made transparency one of their core pillars, particularly when it relates to public policy, which I think is really interesting. It's like a stated pillar and they judge themselves against it. Are we telling people how we're making decisions and why we're lobbying for this particular law and against that particular law, right? So that's tilting towards transparency and openness. Is everyone perfect at it? No. Is there a perfect kind of metric for it? No. But it kind of comes from the approach, the communal approach of sort of open source software and saying, you know, we're better if we communicate with each other and connect with each other and are open about our intentions.
Now you're in 17 cities.
Yeah.
So this is clearly a global phenomena, a national phenomena, but on the other hand, we're here in San Francisco. We're trying to figure out what's happening here that's different. Do you think what's happening
The
in all
cost
these
of housing is different.
But is there something different? I mean, well, or maybe not. Is this phenom just purely and simply global, or is there something else going on in this region that you've been a part of for so long here that really
It's a very good question, because one of the things that I've noticed, and I wrote a piece in February about this, I had gone to 12 cities, I'd done 12 NewCos in 12 different cities in 9 months. I was tired. It was a lot of travel, plus a lot of other travel that I normally had to do, but all of that international travel. And the thing that struck me was how consistent the vibe was in all of the NewCos that I went to. Now, there's selection bias. We're finding new companies and kind of hip old companies that are doing new things like this, right? But when you go into, like in Mexico City, when you go into Startup Mexico, it looks exactly like this. It's almost like everyone's wearing like khakis and like button downs, like in the 90s. Remember that? I mean, it was a little bit unnerving. It was sort of a WeWorkification of the world. But on the other hand, it was also kind of cool. And there were local interpretations and local flavors, but the energy felt very similar everywhere I went. And then I started to reflect on that. One of the key kind of things about NewCos is they are of the city. And one of the big pillars of our narrative is that cities are kind of where we create our biggest problems and where we solve them. And where we come up with the innovations and the compromises and the policy frameworks and the communities that can solve our largest problems. It's the city. The economic core base unit is not the nation state, it's the city. Mm-hmm. And I think increasingly, like if you looked at the Paris talks, the Conference of Mayors at the Paris talks was where all the shit was going down, mm-hmm, mm-hmm, right? That's mm-hmm. where, because when it's time to turn the carbon thing down, you're going to do it at the city level. It's really hard to do it at the national level, mm-hmm. you know. And there's important things that every region has to do, but the city is kind of what we've decided. 1 generation ago, 1/3 of humanity lived in cities. Right now, we crossed 50% last year. And the UN has projected that we'll be at 84% living in cities by the end of this century. So we're kind of committed to the city concept.
Actually, another little fact that in another project we're doing, we just found out, is that for the first time since 1920, the growth rate of cities has surpassed that of suburbs. It's the great migration back of the millennials.
Yeah, I think driverless cars are going to give that a run for its money. That's the thing I'm not totally, haven't fully grokked, is what happens to the suburbs because of that, right? Assuming that happens, which I think in this circumference we do, but I think we have yet to fully litigate all the issues. You know, like basic income. We got some issues. I don't know if you follow, there's a great story, this is I could consider a NewCo story, about, someone wrote a great piece on Medium, I can't remember the author, I should, about the trucking industry and what happens if trucks goes driverless. And you know, you got the truck stops, you got like Madge pouring the coffee, right? You got the prostitutes. You got, and they ran the numbers on what happens to all those jobs if it's just like Volvo trucks with like, you know, Uber software running, right? It was like 7.5 million jobs. If we lost 7.5 million jobs in the United States economy, we would be in the shitter for a really long time. So that's when policy people wake up and Congress people wake up and we start to have a dialogue, right? And I think that's happening right now. It's really interesting.
Well, I'm going to get close here to putting it back to you folks, so start thinking about what you want to take it to the next level here. But what's interesting is I remember you for all the years I've known you is you weren't that political for many years. And
well, this is because I work with Louis Rossetto.
That's exactly.
I mean, Jesus, how do you be political with that guy? It's like
exactly. But
in recent 300 with a 550 hitter.
But in recent years, about the last 5 years, I've watched you get more and more political, more and more interested in climate change and that kind of stuff. And to what extent do you think the story...
You've always been political.
I've always been political. I've been very interested in politics, and there's a lot of folks here who are coming out of that politics. But do you think the story is now it's away from technology, I get that, and I think that's kind of the given, but do you think the story is now moving more to politics and more towards... And how are you thinking about that as your media company, and how would you say, where is that going?
I think for the last 10 years, when it came to the impact that our industry, using the royal our sort of technology industry had, was we could always point to tech and say, oh, that's changing so rapidly and it's innovating and they're just forging ahead and, you know, ask for forgiveness, not for permission, right? And, you know, that's been pretty much the mantra of most of the successful companies that have come out of this region and elsewhere. We just can't do that anymore. And because we now run straight up against, I mean, look, Google for 15 years could kind of, for the most part, get the tech card. Like, hey, you know, they're just a big tech company, and yeah, intellectual property, oh, we'll figure it out, you know, we'll figure that out. But in 5 years, Uber's become the most political company on the planet, right? Mm-hmm. Airbnb, same thing. Like, these companies can't get to the scale they've gotten to without starting massive political dialogues. I think that's awesome, right? I mean, wouldn't it be terrible if that was not the case, right? Mm-hmm. So it's great that these discussions are starting. And the one thing I don't want to say is I have any idea exactly what the solution is. I'm super interested in exploring the story, right? And that's sort of the base case of a journalistic enterprise. Like, let's go explore the story. I have biases. I have some pretty strong biases. I'm biased against the Friedman School. I'm biased against the approach to economics that we've taken for the past 50 years because I kind of think it isn't working. As a matter of fact, Rana Farrar, who wrote a great book you should read, or at least read the interview I did with her, which is on NewCo Shift right now. I asked her a question. In this book basically eviscerated the financial industry, which has 25% of the profits in corporate America and 4% of the jobs. There it is in a nutshell. So 4% of the jobs, 25% of the profits, which means all of that capital is going into the pockets of 4% of the people. So you want to see inequality in action, go to JP Morgan, right? There it is. They're not doing anything that they're not being incented to do by the policies we currently have. They're doing exactly what you would expect them to do. So if you want to change their incentive, you can't yell at them and bully them and call them a-holes. You have to change the expectations, which means you have to have a political conversation. You just do. That's Bernie Sanders, by the way, and Donald Trump. Mm.
Well, it's interesting how politics is breaking up here, and we could basically get into that here in a second. But just to this through line of politics, you're an optimistic guy. You're kind of playing this out. Wired had this optimistic vision. Do you think we're at this moment right now that all the craziness of politics is breaking out for all these reasons, the breakdown reasons? And do you foresee in the next 10 years or something a similar kind of breakthroughs the way we saw the early 90s, early breakthroughs that kind of are now playing out today?
And I think instead of playing with like, you know, MS-DOS and the Apple operating system, and which is the 90s, right? And then it culminated in a big DOJ, you know, suit in 96 against Microsoft and so on. I think we're playing with the operating system of our economy now. That's what the conversation's about. How do we change that? What should the regulatory framework be around that? What is the expectation of a wealthy society to its citizens? You know, I mean, the fact that basic income is actually being discussed openly and with rigor in the Silicon Valley is amazing. It's astonishing. That would have been, well, I'll tell you what Lewis would have thought of that. Like, that would have been heretical. No way. No, are you kidding? But now it's like, wait a minute. Maybe we should learn more. Maybe we should understand this. And it's a very important part of the conversation. And I think that's, you know, it's a sign.
When he makes reference to Lewis, he's talking about Louis Rossetto, the founder of Wired, who was a very strident libertarian. So I will just say this about...
Is,
still, yeah, that's true. Lewis is not here. But just one last thing about that, because you know a lot of people in this tech scene. You know up and down Silicon Valley. You've been up and down every major company. How much of this feeling that you are feeling now and it's coming together in your head, you think is more broadly shared across many kind of tech titans, entrepreneurs, as well as people right through the whole system?
I think there's a lot of disagreement. You know, I think about Peter Thiel's book about how all capitalistic businesses are natural monopolies. And I think, I don't know if I buy that, you know? But so and there's a lot of people who generally agree with that approach. So I think there's some significant, you know, debate, and that's fine. That's great, you know. But I do think to be honest, I've spent more of my time in the last year with people in other countries and other cities and in other industries, because I actually think the story's there. I think that the story about tech is really well covered by very smart people doing really good work on different sides of issues. I also think there's a lot of shit, but I think both those things are true. But I don't think there's a lot of coverage of the impact of tech and other things like that generational bridge that we talked about, or the rise of the cities, or the fact that we've got a narrative force driving this whole thing that is simply unavoidably true, which is if we don't change, half our cities will be underwater in 50 years. So how's that feeling, right? These forces are conspiring to a bigger story that I think the DNA of the media that we have right now is set to cover what they're good at doing, and I think that's why new things start. So, and the thing is, I just don't know how to do anything else. I just don't know how to do anything else but start something.
Final question before we turn it over to everybody else is, this is what's now San Francisco. There is a sense that there's something really special going on here. But if there's, what would you say? Is there something different going on here than you going on?
I think there's a deep unease in this city right now. I feel it. I don't know if you guys feel it, but I feel it. Maybe why the woman in the back row is thinking about running for mayor. That's a long campaign, by the way, Kara. But I think that's an awesome sign, right? Here's somebody who's been deeply involved in the city for a really long time who wants to get really involved, you know? And we haven't talked about your agenda, but my guess is I would probably agree with most of it. Excellent. Well, that wouldn't be the first. Yeah, exactly. But I think that there's a lot of unease right now, right? And once again, San Francisco is, I think, the canary in the coal mine for a bigger story that's happening around the world, right? And once again, I hope that San Francisco will be kind of leading the way as to how we, find our way to a better place. But I think we had from 05, 06, 07 to now a hell of a run, right? Where we felt like we had incorporated the lessons of 2000, 2001, and we weren't going to make that mistake again, right? So we didn't get like a ton of companies public that had no revenue, right? And like no business plan. But at the same time, we got ahead of our skis on how bitchin' we were, right? We just thought we were pretty damn cool. And the whole world said, you're pretty damn cool, and then they built places just like this in every city in the world, right? China just put billions, hundreds of billions of dollars into replicating this model in China, right? Because they think it's a better investment than most traditional financial markets. And so that boom's happening at the moment because there's just slowing growth, and they're looking here and saying, this is how you grow, right? Just make another, couple, Ubers or I almost said Zenefits. I'm sorry. But I think what's interesting is how quickly we self-correct when something like Zenefits or is it Theranos or it's Theranos, right? Or Theranos or Lending Club is how rapidly we try to self-correct that kind of behavior. I think that's a good sign. That's in the business side. But in the politics side of it, I think that the conversation needs to be deeply engaged, and I think we know that. And it's exciting to see people, lean in on that.
That's great. Good thing. So let's shift to you folks.
I came here in 1980. The black population has been cut in half since then. The gay population in the city is falling. So my question about NewCos is how are they going to incorporate inclusiveness in what they're doing? Bloomberg just ran a magazine article about tech companies not even showing up at Howard University to recruit black engineers.
Yeah.
So how are you going to work on that?
Well, first of all, I only got to point 3, so that's in there. Forgive me for not. Forgive me for not doing that, and it's a good point. It's interesting. This issue has, engineers like to look at things in terms of data, right? And so it's very interesting that company after company is starting to actually be transparent and open, which is one of our principles, around their data to this issue, and scoring themselves, and sort of blog post after blog post, apologizing for how bad it is, right? It's not helping. See, I'm not an expert in this particular issue. I think the one thing that it may help with is that it not only raises the issue, but you can't change what you can't measure. And so once they commit to publicly measuring it and then remeasuring it on a regular basis, whether it's semi-annually or annually, then there is this sense that, okay, we need to do something about it, right? And actually just on the way over here, I was listening to yet another piece on NPR about the 82% versus 100% for women, right? And it was about Hollywood, but it may as well apply certainly to here in terms of the salaries. So the ability to get that information and to use that information, that's the only tool that I have as a journalist, is to publish it, to talk about it, to write about it. So we're certainly committed to doing that. Just so you know where the publication is right now, we're in what I call open prototype, and I'm forming a team, and we're hoping to launch a complete ongoing package starting in the fall. But that's certainly one of the issues. What I hear, I'm sure is what you hear, which is that teams that are in fact both inclusive and diverse are far stronger and far better. So then you have to go kind of to the source and say, how do we ensure that we have the possibility of being inclusive in terms of what the bar is for who we employ. And so it's a systemic issue, as most are, which means it's a systemic conversation, right? There isn't like, oh, I got this bullet and I'm going to kill this one here. I got this issue, right?
Got it. Right here, there's one.
Hi, I'm Grace Rubenstein. I'm a journalist covering health science, human behavior with a side beat in immigration. And a question about the increasing concentration of people and innovation in cities. We're already seeing a deepening divide between urban and rural. We're seeing rural places really being left behind. Their young people are leaving, public resources are drying up, and there's huge anger brewing. I'm not only talking about Trumpism here. It's much kind of broader and deeper than that. And as this trend continues, I believe that could become kind of a profound weakness in the system. It's not ultimately a strong system if by century's end you've got 16% by the numbers you have of people essentially marginalized from really where it's all at. So I'm interested, how significant of a weakness do you see that being in this vision, and how do we proactively solve for that?
It's a good question. It's not one I've given much thought to, I'll admit. I think the definition of a city, by the way, would include Kansas City. It would include small cities. The smallest city where we have a NewCo festival is 300,000 people. And so, I think maybe we get the idea of these vast metropolis type cities, but in fact, it's a region that has a center. Connection to that center is fundamental and crucial. I don't know that it makes a ton of sense, perhaps it does, to spend a lot of resources trying to support a lifestyle that most of humanity has said isn't working. And the truth is, suburbs, someone brought that up. Was that you? Suburbs?
Yeah.
Yeah. The suburbs are extremely inefficient and bad for the planet, right? And it's really efficient to mass together in cities. And I don't know that was intentional on everyone's part to move in there. It's probably more economic. But I wish I knew more so I could tell you more, but I don't, so I won't bullshit you. But it sounds like a really interesting issue that we should put someone on writing a piece about.
Absolutely. In the back there?
And if you're interested, I have my cards.
Heather, do you want it? You can pick it. Heather can take it.
Hi, it's Heather King, and I'm with 8 Inc. We're a strategy design firm. We design environments, physical and digital, like the Apple stores. And
Like
we
the
work
Apple
on,
stores or the Apple stores?
They
we did
literally-
the Apple store. We
did
did
the Apple
anyhow.
stores.
It's the best way to explain what we do. We do across
They-
all the different touch
Cool.
points.
Okay.
Anyway, we work with a lot of
Can you stand up just since we're videoing it? Yeah, there
we
we
work
go.
with a lot of old co's that are trying to become new co's and are going through that identity crisis. And yet, it's a really hard thing. So I'm just interested in your perspective of the companies like the Targets that are incubating innovation centers, and it's across the board.
Yes, it is.
But who's doing it well, and why are they doing it well?
Yeah, I get this one a lot. And my examples of who's doing it well are completely refutable, I'm afraid. Walmart. Okay, all caveats. Okay, can we just set those aside, because there's plenty you can argue that they're doing wrong. What they're doing right is that 6 or 7 years ago, they put a stake in the ground and they said, and this was way countervailing to the traditional approach that all large companies who are maximizing shareholder value do. They said, we have decided that we're going to be 100% green energy, renewable energy, and 0% waste, and we are going to judge the value of a product not only by its price and margin to us, but also by its complete impact, its true cost, its true price. Those three things are huge stakes in the ground for a company of that size. But they knew that this was where things were going, and if they got ahead of it, that might be a business advantage.
But by the way, we have someone from the Walmart Innovation Lab, I think, here.
Oh, do we?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, just raise your hand. Oh.
They left.
Oh, okay. Oh, no, sorry. Oh, he's back. Anyhow, you
anyway,
can connect you up with
so
that.
I think what Walmart's done, is so they have two pieces to it. One, I think with the stick they put in the ground there is really important, and by the way, it attracted good employees. The second thing they did was commit completely to being in this ecosystem, because they saw Amazon, was first sort of nibbling on their side dishes and then eating their entire meal, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, right? And they said, we've got to be a player and we have to be in that culture. So they acquired and hired their way to 2,500 engineers here in the Bay Area, which was for a company whose average associate makes, $18,000 a year, to hire 2,500 engineers in the Bay Area, that's not something that's necessarily short-term maximizing shareholder value, right? So that's one. We already talked about Unilever, that's two. GM, that's three. So Mary Barra not only is a woman, she's an engineer, and the first engineer to run that company in a long time, who understands how the product is made, and who came in and said, we have to change the purpose of this company. So what I found time and again is when I am talking to people in these kinds of companies, and they say, we have written a new purpose, or we're in the midst of writing a new purpose, that to me is the most powerful thing that you can do if you're a large company, is actually commit to a purpose that has bite, that has teeth, that means something. Because the number one problem large companies have is not share price, is not competitors eating their lunch. It's they can't hire smart young people. And the reason they can't hire smart young people is because people who have options, like who are Wharton grads or whatever, the top percent, those people have options to go wherever they want. And for them, the determining thing as to where they go is whether the company they join has a purpose that ladders to their values. That is not what happened with my parents when they got a job, okay? They didn't go, well, I don't know, Craig Corporation that makes electronics in Korea. Do you have a purpose that ladders to my vision? That wasn't like the 1960s, But that is increasingly what is the difference between if you can get the good people and you can't get the good people. The thing that drives me crazy about young companies now is they don't know what they don't know. They don't know how to think in 20-year spans. They don't know how to work deeply with regulatory frameworks, right? They know how to move fast and break things. But increasingly, they're learning that they have to learn how to think like big companies, even if they don't want to act like big companies. But they need to understand how to think in 20-year chunks. But the board of P&G meets regularly over a succession plan for their CEO, which includes, are we hiring the best people who 20 years from now will be our CEO?
Catherine, did you say you wanted to? We'll get to other folks here.
Hi, I'm Catherine Fulton. The implication of what you both are saying is that the action isn't just going to be in business, right? So NewCo business, but the blurring of the sectors in terms of government and philanthropy and the social sector, and I'm looking at what's behind your head, that feels like the old story, right? It's not media, it's not democracy, it's not data, it's not housing, it's not philanthropy, you know. So in a way, the story is going to be not the places we looked for the story. Where is innovation going to be, and where do we look for it? So, I mean, I'm curious about how it is we think about mission in a different way, and how we just, you know, to use the disruption thing. So how do you, NewCo?
Well, the way we do it is we're very, we're actually very rigorous when we go into a city about defining, and every city's different, but identifying not only all of the sectors of business that are interesting, that are kind of going off. So in Cincinnati, microbreweries are going off. And the reason they're going off is because Cincinnati was settled by Germans. Go figure. But there's a ton of really interesting microbreweries who are distributing either regionally or nationally. So we have a lot of microbreweries. It's a whole vertical, right? But we also have a public-private partnership vertical, and we have an arts vertical. We have nonprofits, right? And we ask that question in every city we go to, because it turns out that they're deeply involved with the for-profits, obviously, duh, right? So we don't only focus on the businesses, we focus on the organizations. And new kinds of companies, well, most of them are companies. You know, Centrifuge in Cincinnati is a company. It just happens to be a public-private partnership, right? You know, and SFMOMA is, in fact, a company. It just is a different kind of company. And there's lots of different kinds of companies. And that's one of the coolest stories that's happening right now, is what's happening with PBCs and B Corps and all these different kinds of companies, LC3s and all this really interesting stuff. And it's time that those, I think, come out of the shadows and become exemplars for where we might go. So part of what story we want to tell.
I know in the back there, I think you had a question? Isn't that you? Yeah? Oop, no, I thought it was you from the park, right? Yeah, from park here. Sorry, you've been sitting here for a long time. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
No, he has been sitting there for a long time.
Exactly.
Yeah, bring it.
Yeah, no,
we all need a drink.
No, exactly. We're just finishing up here. Yeah, just finish up, and then we'll bring it back.
So I've been involved in technology for 30 years.
Could you give your name and where you're from?
Mike Steep. I run operations for Xerox PARC, which is an innovation center.
Heard of it.
And I've been involved in Apple and
you
all
got
the
ripped
various
off.
companies, Bill Gates, blah, blah, blah. I recently went to a session with my grandkids. They live in Palo Alto, and their parents are tech maniacs who've done very well on the housing boom side of it, and are absolutely freaked out because at the age of 11 or 12, they don't think that they can compete with the current environment, and the parents don't believe they'll actually stay in the community because they can't afford to live here. Mm-hmm. So this squeezing out of the middle class that we talk about nationally is on steroids in Silicon Valley, where the vast majority of people who live here actually can't afford to live here or to save enough money unless they become startup moguls and are able to, you know, get the cash together for the housing part. So thinking about kids as assets, where, you know, they're being developed in a community to replace other people, unless we have really strong immigration policies to replace native-born with people who are highly educated and highly motivated. It's a really difficult issue for these kids, and it's creating problems with social pressure and just competitive nature, and it's really sad to see, having grown up in this valley myself, career-wise, to look at the grandkids and see that we are actually creating an environment that is so much focused on this whole notion of high-speed innovation, high-growth innovation, that it trumps all of the other issues around social responsibility or community or building it for the children. So how would you react to that? You know, we have something called Joint Venture Silicon Valley issued a report saying the Bay Area has gotten actually a lot worse than other parts of the country in disparity of income, but no one pays any attention to it.
I mean, this is a really tough one. First of all, with three kids who've lived that, right? I mean, I grew up like very, very, very middle class. Like, I think we were median income every year. And
in Southern Cal.
In Southern California. And I went to a very, very competitive high school, and the reason that I got in was not that I was particularly bright. My mother took a job to afford it at the school. Discount. And I watch my kids go to a school very much like that now, and I've lived that culture, right? It's a little different where I live, which is in Marin. We smoke a little more dope. But generally speaking, just a little bit more. But
East Bay, Berkeley?
no, Berkeley's got everybody beat. But I've lived there too. I have never lived where you've lived. I have heard the stories, and they sound kind of like what we lived, but far more aggressive, right? It felt like getting into kindergarten in the Upper East Side, stuff like that. I wish I knew a solution to this, other than to say that because the problem's getting so bad, we have to find one, and one will be found, I believe. But there have always been enclaves like the one that you are experiencing, and there probably always will be. The question is whether or not we want that uniformity or that approach to the world to spread throughout the Bay Area, which is the concern not only of this region, but of Brooklyn and Oakland, and it's happening in a lot of the world cities. This is our kind of Marie Antoinette moment. We're headed that way. Everybody knows it. It's an existential sort of crisis that we feel. It's in the air, and I think that's the conversation we need to have, right? And it's going to be a difficult one, because money talks really loudly in this political culture. And you got some really loud people in Palo Alto.
But it's interesting, the two big meta issues, climate change and inequality, it's interesting you put it in there. That's right in there. You had your question here?
You had a question, and then we'll go back.
Okay, sorry. We only have time for a few more.
Thanks for all the softballs, guys. Awesome. I'm not running for anything, so.
I'm David Peters, and you touched very briefly on true cost accounting. Mm-hmm. And I'm interested in how that shows up in the NewCo universe, connecting specifically to transparency,
yes,
which is not really present in the current situation.
We have the equivalent of, everyone probably understands the problem with healthcare, right? The problem with healthcare is that all the data is in different formats, in silos, unconnected, with thickets of legal, regulatory policy, and lots of people making money off the fact that it's so complicated, which means that no one wants to change it. That's healthcare, right? We have the same problem with data as it relates to the question that you raised. How do we get all of the information to understand what true cost is? How do we know that that is clean data? I'll tell you a little story back to Walmart. So Walmart had this idea a few years ago that they were going to make a big commitment to American manufacturing. And so this was literally a board level commitment, because they had to basically ease off a few pennies on the stock to do it, right? And they said, we are going to ensure that we are going to source American manufactured goods. We're going to make an American manufactured section of our store, an American manufactured section of our website, and we're going to sell billions of dollars of American manufactured stuff over a period of 5 years. They announced it. They made a commitment to bring 250,000 American manufacturing jobs back by the impact of this decision. And it has stumbled on the data. They can't be sure that the teak handle of the barbecue is in fact manufactured in America, because there isn't any data about the origin of that teak handle, right? And so therefore what happens is the lawyers get out there and they start suing them under FTC guidelines for false advertising that is in fact not American manufacturing. And then you get the reaction you would expect, which is they pull their horns out, right? So our problem with true cost is the problem this industry is good at solving, which is, okay, the healthcare site goes down, let's get some people who know what the hell they're doing in there and fix it, right? And so there are these wonderfully large, very hard, and super important problems that we need to solve to get transparency and clean data through the pipes so that we can understand the true impact of a plastic, scooter from China that costs, $13 compared to a $20 one that's built near where you live. And the true cost probably, intellectually, might be that they're sort of equate, from the, you got to put it on a big cargo ship and ship it over here, and it's made out of like shitty composite plastics that, hurt the environment and, never, and this one's made out of recyclable, whatever. But we need incentives to drive that data ecosystem to reality, and those incentives get driven first by localities, and then by national governments. And so, that's why I think it's like stuff like when Berkeley passes a tax, essentially on corn syrup, that's the start of something, right? And so I think we're going to see more and more of that, and that's how it happens. But it doesn't happen fast. But it has to happen. We need the data.
Now, folks, we're going to take a couple more, but then we're going to allow people to grab a drink, and actually John's going to be hanging here for a while. So I know Ron wanted to say something. Or wait, you were going to, give your answer, and then we'll get one more over here.
Hi. Can you hear me?
And Kara, we'll give Kara the last question.
Oh, damn.
Save a tough one.
So can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Edward Strickland, and I'm a writer, and I'm writing about some behavioral economics. And I'm working with the Center of Advanced Study of Behavioral Science at Stanford and doing some research and some experiments in social change and doing some measurements. I was formerly an IBM global entrepreneur that worked with Smarter Planet initiatives and big data about 6 years ago. So when you spoke about the narrative changing, do you see the American dream changing with the new generation in regards to the method of living? Because when the industrial complex was developed, the American dream was developed at the same time.
Yep.
The revolution has changed. The migration has changed from people moving from the suburbs to the city, but it's a different method of moving here. I spoke to a young person who was a developer with Android. He was at the Google conference, I/O, and he said he moved here from another location with a group.
Yeah.
A group of 10 people. They moved to this area all together.
They probably all lived in the same room.
They all live together, and they've been here for 8 years, sustaining themselves. But the lifestyle of what's driving them is not consumerism. It's something different. Even though he spoke of triple bottom line, people, planet, profit, do you feel that that's enough for them to sustain on in the future at the rate of which climate change is moving? Because if we don't change, we will have an abrupt change. And the theories sometimes are gradual change can make some progress, but an actual shift in paradigm needs an explosion. There will be casualties from that. Are you seeing that type of migration in your experience?
I'd like to say that it won't happen, but I believe it will. I think that we're going to tip and things are going to go fast. And it's going to be a ripping story. And it is. And, lots of people are going to be dislocated. Lots of people are going to die. Lots of people are not. A lot of people are going to thrive. But I think we're going to have a shift. What is the next American dream? What an awesome piece. I mean, what a great question for a story. But I think that, what we've all bought for the last 50 years is clearly not even possible anymore. With most of the people who are the age of the people you were talking to are probably under extreme student debt, right? Just making their payments and making a living, right? And so, I think home ownership has been pushed out by 2 or 3 years over the past 10 years. That's a fast shift in terms of the average age of the first-time homeowner. So that's a pretty significant shift that's already happening, right? And then, you have the theory that everyone's not going to be owning stuff anymore and they're all going to be sharing it, or we don't need to own it, we just need to access it, right? I'm like, I go back to like Get Off My Lawn on that one. I'm like the old guy. I'm like, give me like songs, man, But so I don't think I'm in the norm on that one. And my kids kind of like the idea of at least having a car that they can share between them, right? And because I thought maybe they would go for that, and I wouldn't have to I wouldn't have to get them a car. But but at the end of the day, I don't know where that one's going. I don't know if that's a trend or a fad or really going to be true that people are going to sort of technology is going to effortlessly bring us everything we need at a marginal cost that actually makes sense. Because that last part, the marginal cost that makes sense, hasn't been proven yet at all. So we'll see. But I think the American dream is going to be completely redefined. I just don't know quite what it will be.
Okay, we're going to do a quick one here to Ron, and then we're going to go to Karen, and then we're going to all get a drink.
It might be fulfilling work, by the way.
So I'm Ron Stoltz. I spent my first half of my career in technology and the last half in policy, mainly at the federal government level. So it cues a little bit off of what Catherine said, because my learning journey, and this is a GBN phrase, for the last 6 months to a year, is fairness and empathy. So I wonder if you can, this is really to Peter also, can you innovate approaches to fairness, and can you innovate empathy? And the reason I ask that is my son, who is a copyright lawyer, he works for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF. We talk a lot about, well, what's the fundamental underpinning behind the approaches that they take? And they try to take the approach of fairness, if you will. But if you talk across the political spectrum, fairness is differently defined. So the question is fairness one of the principles for NewCo? Is it even a conversation? And then secondly, can you innovate fairness, and can you innovate empathy?
Yeah. I don't know that fairness is in how we define being a NewCo, but it's certainly a value of NewCo. I would, I don't remember if it's actually in I wrote a manifesto, because that's what you do when you start something. But I don't know if it's in there, but it's certainly, it could be, the ingredients of fairness are in there. In terms of the innovation, it might be, inclusiveness is, but I'm not sure about fairness. But to your second point, and then I'll let you chime in here. I think that goes to education, because I think that's where we collectively stick our new humans for a long period of time, and where they learn kind of the rules of the road. And so if you build that into the rules of the road, so my kids were fortunate enough to go to a school where that was fundamental, right? And it was built into the philosophy. When there was any dispute, they went to that. They went to, are you being fair? Are you being inclusive? And like the ability to have that in a kid's life when they're growing up as a medium of dispute, and then also to not make it about a competitive environment where this 10% were achievers and they were identified and selected out and put in the achiever place, right? And then these guys were the laggards and they were kind of put over here, and the people in the middle just muddled along, right? Which is my public school experience, right? But that, you can change the system. That's where you change it. I'm watching a new approach to education called alt school, which started here. Of course, Max Ventia is a Google guy who knows, but I think it's super interesting, and their goal, their mission is super NewCo. It's like we're going to completely rethink how education works, including not having grade levels. If grade levels don't serve a kid, then we don't have grade levels, right? We have groups who are in the same, place, and then maybe some move faster, maybe some move slower, but they move, right? So and they have all sorts of other cool stuff. Like, that's where we want to see the innovation if we want to address the issues that you raised, I think, is in the schools.
I don't have much more to add to that. Now, I think let's go to Kara, and I'll talk after that on a couple.
I thought if I talked long enough, then I wouldn't get grilled by Kara.
That'd be good.
You look fantastic, by the way.
Thank you.
Two things. One is this idea of NewCo. Can you really say that there's a NewCo? Because I think the most probably successful company right now is Uber, which is aggressive, fascist, somewhat rapacious, mean. You know what I mean? It's not like what you were talking about, and they're doing great. They're doing obviously great across the globe. So that's the first one. Can you really pick a NewCo that has these attributes? Because some of those do. It sounds a little Facebooky. trying to be nice to the conservatives, and no, we really like the liberals. That, they're trying all kinds of things. So that's the first question, because I don't think there is a NewCo. I think in some way there isn't sort of a map, because the ones that are succeeding are vastly different from each other. And then secondly, since you've been in publishing forever, like myself, for a dog's age, why are you publishing now, and what do you think the challenges?
That's a great question.
I'm here with the CTO of Vox Media, actually, who's Trey,
awesome.
who's fantastic. What do you think you have to do to succeed in publishing today? Because obviously
let me
have changed.
address the first one first. I think there are NewCos, actually for the first 3 years of NewCo. Not that Uber cared, but we had applications. We have applications every year for NewCo. That you have to do an application. You have to answer a question: how are you making positive change in the world, and what's your mission, and things like that. Uber never applied, and we never asked them to. And that was on purpose. If they had applied, it would have been uncomfortable. We would have had to say no to them, because, and that goes to the issue that I talked about before, which is it's hard to do the metrics, right, of what makes a NewCo, and I'm hoping that we can start to get there, and we're working on some of them. But the fact is, it's kind of it when you see it, right? And we tend towards inclusiveness, which is if a company can answer these questions, better to have them kind of be part of what feels like a movement towards being a non-sort of douchebaggy kind of company, and being on the record that you're that. And then if the next year they've just had a record of basically not being very NewCo in their output and their values, then we won't invite them back. That's the way I've thought about it. So last year, Uber was a NewCo. And I guess the jury's out.
Did they change in some way that I'm not aware of?
I think they started to grow up. They started to hire people who were adults and who weren't all about asking for forgiveness instead of permission, who started reaching out and engaging with actual political process as opposed to doing pincher movements on Portland,
Austin disagrees.
Well, actually, Austin's a really interesting case, right? I think that blew up in their face when they decided they would write the legislation, when they decided that they would spend $8 million and just roll through and Austin just said, keep Austin weird, and I think that was really cool in a way, that happened and important, a moment for both the companies. It wasn't just Uber. The Happy Friendly Pink company kind of got in the middle of that too, Lyft. So, I tend more towards optimism and saying, hey, come on in, let's try to all act good about this. And then if the company acts in a poor fashion, then say, okay, but it's a hard question and a fair one, because it's you asking it. I'm not surprised. On the second one, I have some very strong ideas about how we make a media business work, particularly in this space, some of which I don't really want to go into because I don't want to necessarily jinx it. It's not that I feel like my ideas are somehow genius, but they do depart from traditional approaches to publishing that have to do with getting lots of advertising. One of those departures is that we will be doing membership. Not immediately, but after a while. We have now festivals in 17 cities, and it's going to be probably at 25 by the end of next year. We're doing China later this year. We're opening up all sorts of interesting markets. That's interesting as a membership benefit, to be able to go to these festivals. And there are other things that we're doing that we think are interesting that can create kind of a more valuable membership than simply you get our articles before anybody else does. Right? I think that's part of it, but I don't think it's enough until we actually have a media product that is, I need this every day because if I don't have it, I'm not going to do as good a job as I could. So it's that last part that I'm working on.
And I think
editorially.
That's a good place to stop, I think, and say thanks for everyone for coming here, kicking off this series. We're going to be doing them now every month. Next month, we've got Kevin Kelly launching his new book. It's essentially going to be his book party locally, and he is going to come prepared to ask everyone who comes the questions, and we're going to instantaneously put them up here. He has a million questions he wants to ask you, which will be a really interesting thing. And after that, in July, we have Saul Griffith, who, if you know Saul, he's a genius, and he wants to map out the entire energy flows of the United States on this thing right here. He's got a bunch of folks working on it, coding it now, and he'll reveal it for the first time here. That's what he wants to do. So we got a good lineup coming, and it's going to keep going every month through the year. Love to have you keep coming back and bring innovative folks. Let's have a good time this year. But thank you, John.
Right on.
Thank you, everybody.